One $5 latte didn't just ruin a $5,000 suit. It looked like it was about to end her life. She thought she was staring at a monster. He was staring at his obsession. But first, he was going to let her sweat. In the heart of the city, the Morning Grind coffee shop is a chaotic battlefield of steam and orders. For Sienna, a struggling art student working double shifts, it's just another day of survival. She is invisible to the high-powered clientele she serves until she crashes into Ryu Sunyi. He is the Prince of Darkness in the corporate world, a rumor whispered in boardrooms, the heir to a K-Mafia legacy trying to go legitimate. When their worlds collide over a spilled dark roast, a misunderstanding sparks a dangerous obsession. Do you love protective CEOs and Mafia Romance? Then hit that like button right now. Let's aim for 1,000 likes to unlock the next chapter. Put on your headphones, get comfortable, and let's find out why he didn't fire her. He claimed her. The steam wand on the espresso machine screamed, a piercing shriek that matched the chaos inside Sienna's head. It was 8:45 a.m. at the Morning Grind, and the line of caffeine-deprived Seoulites snake out the door. Sienna wiped a bead of sweat from her temple with the back of her wrist, her braids pulled back into a tight, practical bun that was already starting to fray at the edges. Order for table 4, venti americano, 3 caramel macchiatos, extra hot, the barista shouted, sliding the heavy tray onto the counter. Sienna grabbed the edges of the tray, the ceramic mugs rattling against the saucers. She was running on 3 hours of sleep and an empty stomach, her tuition deadline looming like a storm cloud over her week. If she missed this shift, she missed rent. If she missed rent, she was on the street. "Coming through, please," she called out, her voice barely audible over the din of clacking laptops and indie pop music. She navigated the narrow aisle between the tables like a dancer, twisting her hips to avoid a jutting elbow, sidestepping a forgotten umbrella. She was 5 steps away from table 4, just 5 steps. Then disaster struck. A woman in an oversized beige trench coat stood up abruptly, swinging a designer tote bag over her shoulder without looking. The heavy leather strap caught Sienna's ankle. There was no time to correct her balance. Gravity, cruel and immediate, took hold. Sienna pitched forward. Her hands instinctively tightened on the tray, but it was useless. The tray tipped, launching its cargo into the air. For a split second, time seemed to warp into slow motion. Sienna watched in horror as 4 cups of scalding, sticky, dark liquid defied physics, arcing through the air with terrifying precision. They didn't hit the floor. They didn't hit the table. They hit the chest of a man who had just walked through the entrance. The sound of the impact was a wet, heavy slap, followed by the shattering of ceramic on the hardwood floor. Then, absolute silence. The chatter stopped. The typing stopped. Even the espresso machine seemed to hold its breath. Sienna scrambled to her knees, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Oh my God, I am so sorry. She looked up, expecting to see a furious customer wiping coffee off a parka or a hoodie. Instead, she found herself staring at a wall of charcoal gray wool. The suit was immaculate, or it had been 3 seconds ago. Now, a dark, jagged stain was spreading rapidly across the chest, soaking into the silk tie and the crisp white shirt beneath. The man didn't flinch. He didn't yelp from the heat, though the coffee had been boiling moments ago. He simply stood there motionless, like a statue carved from ice and arrogance. Trembling, Sienna forced her eyes upward. She traveled past the ruined suit, past the sharp, unforgiving jawline, and met his gaze. His eyes were obsidian, dark and bottomless, devoid of any human warmth. They weren't looking at the stain, they were locked on her. Sienna's breath hitched in her throat. The air around him felt colder, heavier. Her eyes darted to the lapel of his ruined jacket. Glinting in the morning light was a small, silver pin shaped like a coiled dragon. The blood drained from her face. She knew that crest. Everyone in the district whispered about it, but you weren't supposed to see it in daylight. It belonged to the Ryu syndicate. This wasn't just a businessman. This was a predator in a $5,000 skin. I'm dead, she thought, her lungs seizing up. I just poured boiling coffee on a monster. She tried to speak, to offer to pay for the cleaning, to beg for her life, but her throat closed up. The room began to spin. Short, shallow gasps escaped her lips as the panic set in, blurring the edges of her vision. She was going to be fired. She was going to be sued. And if the rumors about the Ryu family were true, she might not even make it out of the shop. The heat seared through the layers of Italian wool and Egyptian cotton instantly, biting into the skin of his chest like a chemical burn. It was a shock of pain that would have made a lesser man recoil or shout, but Ryu Sunyi did not flinch. He had endured worse things than boiling espresso. He simply exhaled, a slow, controlled breath through his nose, grounding himself against the sudden flare of agony while calculating the damage. A $5,000 suit ruined, a meeting delayed, a morning wasted. Behind him, the air shifted violently. He felt the vibration of heavy footsteps on the floorboards before he heard them. His security detail. 2 men, built like granite and trained to break bones at the slightest provocation, surged forward. Their shadows eclipsed the light, looming over the small figure crumpled on the floor. He could feel their intent radiating off them, violence as a reflex, a need to punish the threat. Sunyi raised his right hand. He didn't turn around. He simply extended a single finger. Stop. The movement was slight, barely a twitch, but the effect was absolute. His men froze mid-step, retreating back into the periphery like disciplined dogs. He didn't need a scene. He didn't need witnesses uploading shaky cell phone footage of a beatdown to the internet. He needed silence, and he had it. The entire cafe had fallen into a hush so deep he could hear the hum of the refrigerator units. He lowered his gaze, ready to dissect the incompetent fool who had dared to touch him. He expected a careless hipster glued to a phone or a hungover salaryman rushing to a cubicle. He prepared a scathing dismissal that would wither them where they stood. Instead, he found Sienna. She was on her knees, surrounded by a jagged halo of shattered white porcelain and dark brown puddles. She was a chaotic splash of color against the drab floor, dark, luminous skin and braids that had been pulled back severe and tight, though a few stray coils had escaped in the fall to frame her face. But it was her eyes that arrested him. They were wide, frantic, enormous orbs of liquid brown that held a terror so pure it felt foreign to him. In his world, fear was transactional. People feared him because they owed him money, or because they had betrayed him, or because they knew the weight of the Ryu name. But this girl looked at him like he was the devil himself come to collect a soul. It was raw, unfiltered. She was shaking so violently that he could hear the faint rustle of her apron against her uniform. She wasn't just afraid of the consequences, she was afraid of him. Innocence, the word drifted through his mind, unbidden and strange. She radiated a frantic, messy innocence that clashed violently with the sharp, cold lines of his existence. She looked like a bird that had flown full speed into a glass window, stunned, fragile, and utterly at his mercy. A normal man would yell. A kind man would help her up. Sunyi was neither. He felt a dark, curling curiosity unfurl in his gut, overriding the burning sensation on his chest. He didn't want to dismiss her anymore. He wanted to study her. What would she do if he gave her nothing? No anger, no forgiveness, just the suffocating weight of his presence. He kept his face blank, a perfect marble mask of indifference, and stayed dangerously silent. He locked eyes with her and waited, letting the tension stretch until it was nearly unbearable. He wanted to see if she would run, faint, or fight. The silence stretched, pulling tight around Sienna's throat like a noose. The man, this terrifying, beautiful statue of a man, hadn't said a word. He just watched her, his gaze heavy and unreadable, as if he were dissecting a frog in a lab. Panic, hot and irrational, clawed at her chest. She had to do something. She had to fix this before the police came, or worse, before the men behind him decided to handle it themselves. I can fix it, she stammered, her voice cracking. She scrambled to her feet, snatching a handful of rough, brown paper napkins from the dispenser on the nearest table. Please, let me just. She reached out, her hand shaking violently, aiming to dab the dark stains spreading across his chest. She never made contact. A massive hand clamped around her wrist, stopping her inches from the ruined suit. It wasn't the CEO. It was one of the shadows behind him. The bodyguard had moved with terrifying speed, stepping between her and his boss like a concrete wall. His grip was iron, not painful enough to break bone, but firm enough to tell her that if she moved another inch, he would snap her like a twig. "Do not touch him," the bodyguard growled, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in her bones. Sienna gasped, shrinking back as he released her wrist. She stumbled, hitting her hip against the counter. Tears pricked her eyes, hot and stinging. She was making it worse. She was going to die here over a spilled latte. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry," she cried, the words tumbling out in a frantic stream. "I didn't mean to touch. I just wanted to help. I'll pay for it. I swear I'll pay for the cleaning." The CEO didn't blink. He looked at the cheap napkins in her hand, then up to her face, his expression bored, almost disappointed. Money, she needed money. That's what people like him understood. Sienna spun around, ignoring the gasp of the customers watching the train wreck unfold. She grabbed her canvas tote bag from under the counter and ripped it open. She dug past her sketchbook and her worn-out sneakers until her fingers closed around the cold glass of her personal tip jar. It was an old jam jar, half full of the week's earnings, her lifeline for groceries. She turned back to him and dumped the contents into her trembling, cupped hands. Clatter, ching, thud. The sound was deafening in the quiet shop, a pathetic rain of copper and nickel. A few crumpled $1 bills fluttered to the floor like dead leaves. "Here," she choked out, thrusting her hands toward him. Her palms were dirty with coffee grounds and filled with pennies, dimes, and quarters. "Take it. It's all I have on me right now, but I can get more on Friday. Please don't sue me." The offer hung in the air, absurd and tragic. Ryu Sunyi looked down at her hands. He stared at the mountain of loose change, the tarnished pennies that wouldn't even cover the tax on his morning coffee, let alone the dry cleaning for a bespoke Italian suit. For a moment, Sienna thought she saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Confusion, pity, amusement. It was gone too fast to trace. He didn't take the money. He didn't yell. He simply adjusted his cuffs, the movement elegant and dismissive. Then, without a word, he turned on his heel. The bodyguards fell into step behind him, a phalanx of black wool moving in perfect synchronization. They walked out the door, the bell chiming cheerfully above their heads, leaving Sienna standing there with her hands full of pennies. As the black sedan pulled away from the curb, Sienna's legs finally gave out. She sank to the floor, the coins spilling from her hands and rolling under the tables. She buried her face in her knees, waiting for her manager to come out and fire her, convinced that her life was effectively over. The interior of the Maybach was hermetically sealed from the noise of the city, a quiet sanctuary of black leather and climate control. Ryu Sunyi sat in the back seat, the smell of burnt Arabica beans filling the cabin, clashing violently with the scent of his expensive cologne. The coffee had cooled, leaving a sticky, ruined map across the front of his bespoke charcoal suit, but he made no move to clean it. He didn't even seem to notice the discomfort. His attention was entirely focused on the small, tarnished object resting in the center of his palm. It was a penny, a 2018 Lincoln penny, scratched and dull, smelling faintly of copper and desperation. He had taken it from her trembling hand right before he turned to leave. He wasn't sure why. Perhaps it was the absurdity of it, a woman offering pocket change to a man who owned half the skyline. Or perhaps it was the way she had looked when she offered it, like she was handing over a piece of her soul to bargain with a reaper. "Director Ryu," his assistant, Mr. Choi, spoke from the front seat, his voice hesitant. He was holding a tablet, tapping furiously. "I've canceled the morning board meeting. Shall I have the driver take you to the penthouse to change? We can have the suit incinerated." "No," Sunyi said, his voice low. He rolled the penny between his thumb and forefinger. "Who is she?" Mr. Choi paused, surprised by the question. He adjusted his glasses and typed for a few seconds longer. The Ryu Syndicate's information network was faster than any government database. "The barista? Her name is Sienna, 22 years old. She's a scholarship student at the University of Arts, majoring in oil painting." Sunyi didn't look up. "Keep going." "She works 2 jobs. The morning grind on weekdays, a warehouse shift on weekends, Choi continued, reading the data as it streamed in. Her financial records are bleak, sir. Her father passed 2 years ago. She's the sole provider for her mother, who is currently in a long-term care facility for early-onset dementia. She's 3 months behind on tuition. Sun Yi's hand stopped moving. The penny pressed into the pad of his thumb. 3 months behind on tuition. A sick mother, 2 jobs. He looked down at the coin again. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The handful of change she had dumped into his hands wasn't just a pathetic attempt at restitution. It was likely her lunch money for the week, maybe her subway fare. She had emptied her pockets for him, offering up her survival to save herself from his wrath. A strange, unfamiliar sensation tightened inside his chest. It wasn't pity. Ryu Sun Yi did not feel pity. It was something sharper. It was a sudden, violent annoyance at the world that had put her in that position. She was terrified, Sun Yi murmured, more to himself than to his assistant. She wasn't just afraid of me, she was afraid of losing that job. He remembered the way she had flinched when the door chimed, the way her eyes darted around the shop like a cornered animal. Someone had taught her that fear. Someone made her feel that a spilled coffee was a capital offense worth hyperventilating over. "Pull up the ownership records for that coffee shop," Sun Yi ordered, his voice dropping to a temperature that frosted the air in the car. He closed his fist around the penny, the metal biting into his skin. "I want to know exactly who she answers to." The back office of the morning grind was a windowless closet that smelled of receipt paper and stale bleach. It was too small for 2 people, which made Mr. Henderson's screaming feel like a physical assault. "Look at this, just look at it." Henderson jabbed a thick finger at the grainy monitor, where the black-and-white security footage played on a loop. On the screen, a pixelated Sienna tripped, the coffee flew, and the suit was ruined. "Do you have any idea who that was? That wasn't just some hipster looking for free Wi-Fi, Sienna. That was a VIP, a man who could buy this entire block and turn it into a parking lot." Sienna stood with her back pressed against the filing cabinet, her hands clasped tightly behind her to hide the shaking. "I'm sorry, Mr. Henderson. It was an accident. The customer left her bag." "I don't care about the bag." Henderson slammed his hand on the desk, making the stapler jump. His face was flushed a blotchy red. "I care about the reputation of this franchise. You humiliated us. You insulted a man wearing a suit that costs more than you make in a year." He leaned in close, invading her personal space until she could smell the onions from his lunch on his breath. "You are lucky I'm short-staffed, or you'd be out on the street right now. But let me be clear, you are on thin ice. Use your head or get out." He dismissed her with a wave of disgust. Sienna stumbled out of the office, her knees weak, fighting the urge to vomit. The next 3 days were a blur of psychological torture. Every time the brass bell above the door chimed, Sienna flinched, her heart hammering against her ribs. She didn't hear a customer entering. She heard a gavel banging. She expected the police to walk in with handcuffs. She expected a lawyer in a sharp suit to slap a lawsuit on the counter that would garnish her wages for the rest of her life. She expected the man with the dragon pin to come back to finish what his eyes had started. She wiped tables until the varnish wore thin. She checked orders 3 times before calling them out. She moved like a ghost, terrified that breathing too loud would trigger the final catastrophe. But the man didn't come back. Instead, something else did. It started on Tuesday. Sienna was taking out the trash during the lull after the morning rush when she saw it. A black sedan, sleek and predatory, parked across the street. The windows were tinted so dark they looked like oil slicks. It was impossible to see inside. She ignored it at first. This was the financial district. Expensive cars were part of the scenery. But it was there again on Wednesday. Same spot. Same idle engine purring low like a sleeping beast. And again on Thursday. Sienna wiped the condensation off the front window, peering through the glass. The car hadn't moved for 3 hours. It just sat there, facing the shop. She felt a prickle of unease crawl up her spine, a sensation of being watched that made the hair on her arms stand up. "Hey, Sienna, stop daydreaming and refill the sugar stations." Henderson barked from the espresso machine. Sienna jumped, dropping her rag. She looked back at the car one last time. It felt like a shark circling a tank, waiting for the glass to crack. She didn't know who was inside, but she knew, with a sinking dread in her gut, that they were watching her. The glass walls of Ryu Sunyi's office on the 50th floor offered a panoramic view of Seoul's skyline, a glittering testament to the power he held in the palm of his hand. Yet, for the past hour, the master of the Ryu syndicate had turned his back on the city. His attention was fixed on a single, high-definition monitor embedded in his mahogany desk. It was a live feed from the security cameras at the morning grind. He told himself it was due diligence. He needed to assess the liability of the establishment. He needed to know if the girl, Sienna, was a plant sent by a rival family. But as he watched her wipe down a counter with exhausted, repetitive strokes, he knew he was lying to himself. He wasn't assessing a threat. He was watching a curiosity. On the screen, the door to the back office flew open. A man, Sunyi recognized him from the dossier as Henderson, the store manager, stormed out. Even without audio, the aggression was palpable. Henderson's face was contorted, his gestures wild and threatening. He cornered Sienna against the espresso machine, looming over her small frame. Sunyi leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. The air in his office grew heavy. Then, Henderson made a mistake. As Sienna tried to step away, Henderson reached out and grabbed her upper arm. It wasn't a gentle touch. It was a rough, jerking motion that made Sienna wince visibly on the screen. She shrank back, her shoulders hunching in a posture of learned defeat. A sharp crack echoed through the silent office. Sunyi looked down. The fountain pen in his hand had snapped in two, ink bleeding black across his fingers like oil. The burning sensation in his chest returned, but this time, it wasn't from spilled coffee. It was a cold, white-hot fury that started in his gut and froze his veins. He didn't just want to hurt Henderson. He wanted to erase him. He wanted to ensure that no one would ever dare to lay a hand on her again. He didn't call his security team. Physical violence was crude, a tool for the streets. Ryu Sunyi fought with capital. He reached for the intercom, his voice devoid of emotion. "Mr. Choi, get legal on the line, now." 10 seconds later, the head of his acquisitions department was on the speakerphone, sounding breathless. "Director Ryu, we weren't expecting." "The Morning Grind franchise," Sunyi cut him off, staring at the frozen image of Henderson's hand on Sienna's arm. "Who owns the parent company?" "That would be, let me check. Global Roast Holdings, sir. They have 40 locations across the city." "Buy them." There was a stunned silence on the other end. "Sir, you want to buy a specific location?" "No," Sunyi said, wiping the ink from his hand with a silk handkerchief. "I want the parent company. I want the entire chain, majority stake, and I want it done before the market opens tomorrow morning." That's a hostile takeover, sir. It will cost a premium. The board will have questions about the strategic value of a mid-tier coffee chain." "Tell the board I'm diversifying my portfolio," Sunyi said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "If they have questions, they can bring them to me personally. Get it done, Choi. I want the deed to that building on my desk by 8:00 a.m. He cut the line. Sunyi looked back at the screen. Henderson had released Sienna and was storming away, leaving her rubbing her arm. Sunyi watched her for a moment longer, a dark satisfaction settling over him. She didn't know it yet, but she was no longer working for a petty tyrant. She was working for the Ryu syndicate. She was his employee, his responsibility. His. Friday arrived with the weight of a sledgehammer. The lunchtime rush at the morning grind was a beast that consumed everything in its path, swallowing Sienna's energy and spitting out tickets faster than she could read them. The air was thick with the smell of burnt milk and the cacophony of impatient voices. "I said soy milk. This is oat," a customer snapped, shoving a cup back across the counter. "I'm so sorry, I'll remake it right away," Sienna said, her voice hoarse. Her hands were trembling. She hadn't slept more than 4 hours a night since the incident with the suit. Every shadow looked like a lawyer, every black car looked like a hearse. She turned to the espresso machine, her mind foggy with exhaustion. She grabbed the soy milk carton, or at least she thought she did. In her haste, her fingers slipped on the condensation. The carton hit the counter, splattering white liquid across the workspace and onto the shoes of the customer waiting at the handoff plane. "Are you serious?" the customer groaned. Before Sienna could apologize, a shadow fell over her. Mr. Henderson didn't just walk over, he materialized like a thundercloud. He had been waiting for this. He had been watching her like a hawk all week, hungry for a slip-up, and she had just handed it to him on a silver platter. "That is it," he roared. The sound cut through the noise of the cafe like a gunshot. He stormed behind the counter, grabbing Sienna by the elbow. His grip was bruising, his fingernails digging into her skin through her uniform. He didn't pull her into the back office this time. He dragged her out onto the main floor, right in front of the line of customers. "I have had enough of your incompetence," Henderson shouted, his face purple with rage. He gestured wildly at the mess on the counter. "First you assault a VIP, now you're throwing milk at customers. You are a liability, Sienna. You are useless." The cafe went deathly silent, 30 pairs of eyes fixed on her. Sienna felt the heat rise in her cheeks, a burning humiliation that made her want to dissolve into the floor. She tried to pull her arm away, but he held fast. "Please, Mr. Henderson," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I'm sorry, I'm just tired, I'll clean it up. Please don't do this here." "I am doing this here so everyone can see what happens when you don't do your job," he sneered, playing to the audience. "You think you can just drift through life, ruining things for hardworking people. Not in my store." He shoved her toward the door. "Get your things, you're done. Don't bother clocking out, you're fired." The word hung in the air, final and devastating. Fired. The panic that had been simmering in her gut for days finally boiled over. It wasn't just about the job. It was the tuition payment due on Monday. It was the medication for her mother. It was rent. Without this paycheck, the delicate house of cards that was her life would collapse. Tears, hot and humiliating, welled in her eyes. She couldn't stop them. "Mr. Henderson, please," she begged, ignoring the stares of the customers. She clasped her hands together, desperate. "I need this job. I can't lose this job. Just give me one more chance. I'll work the weekend shift for free. Please." "I don't want your charity. I want you gone," Henderson spat, pointing a shaking finger at the exit. "Get out before I call the police for trespassing." Sienna stood there, broken, the tears finally spilling over her cheeks. She looked around the room, silently pleading for someone to help, but everyone looked away, staring at their phones, their shoes, anywhere but at the girl begging for her life. She was alone, truly, completely alone. The Maybach glided through the midday traffic like a shark through dark water. Ryu Sunyi sat in the rear, reviewing the acquisition contracts on his tablet. The deal for Global Roast Holdings had closed at 4:00 a.m. He technically owned the coffee shop Sienna worked in, along with 39 others, but he hadn't yet decided how to break the news to the local management. He glanced out the tinted window as the car neared the intersection of 4th and Main. He always looked. It was a reflex now. What he saw made his blood run cold. Through the plate glass window of the morning grind, he saw a crowd, and in the center of it, he saw Sienna. She wasn't behind the counter. She was standing in the middle of the customer area, her head bowed, her shoulders shaking. And looming over her, red-faced and gesticulating wildly, was Henderson. Sunyi saw the man's finger jab into Sienna's face. He saw her recoil. He saw the way she clasped her hands together in a plea that was painfully familiar. The tablet in his hand hit the leather seat with a dull thud. "Stop the car," Sunyi ordered. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of an execution order. "Sir, we are in a no-stopping zone," the driver began, glancing at the rear-view mirror. "The meeting with the minister is in." "I said stop the car." The driver slammed on the brakes. The heavy sedan lurched to a halt in the middle of the bus lane, horns blaring behind them. Sunyi didn't wait for his security detail in the trail car to catch up. He didn't wait for his driver to run around and open the door. He shoved the door open himself and stepped out onto the asphalt. The sounds of the city, the honking, the wind, the chatter, faded into white noise. All he could hear was the pounding of his own heart, a drumbeat of pure, unadulterated rage. He adjusted his cuffs, shooting them straight, and buttoned his suit jacket. It was a new suit, navy blue this time, sharper than a razor blade. He walked toward the coffee shop. He didn't rush. Predators didn't run, they stalked. His bodyguards scrambled out of the trailing SUV, shouting into their radios, rushing to form a perimeter around him, but he ignored them. He reached the glass door of the shop and pushed it open. The bell chimed. It was a cheerful, innocent sound that clashed violently with the atmosphere he brought with him. Inside, Henderson was still shouting, "Police for trespassing, I want you gone." Then silence. It started at the door and rippled outward like a shockwave. The customers near the entrance stopped talking. They lowered their phones. They stepped back, instinctively parting to create a path. Henderson froze, sensing the shift in the room. He turned around, his mouth still open, his face flushed with the high of his power trip. Suni stood in the doorway. He didn't look at Henderson. He didn't look at the crowd. His eyes locked instantly on Sienna. She looked shattered. Her eyes were red-rimmed and wet, her posture defeated. She looked like she had been waiting for the final blow. When she saw him, her breath hitched. Her eyes went wide, the terror returning, but this time it was mixed with confusion. She recognized him, the man with the ruined suit, the monster. Suni took a step forward. The air in the shop seemed to drop 10 degrees. The silence was absolute, heavy and suffocating. He walked past the frozen customers, his footsteps slow and deliberate on the hardwood floor. Click, click, click. He stopped 3 feet from Henderson, towering over the shorter man. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, radiating a darkness so profound it made the manager's petty anger look like a child's tantrum. The predator had entered the den, and he was hungry. Sienna felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. It was him, the man from Monday, the owner of the $5,000 suit. He stood in the center of the shop like a monolith, sucking all the oxygen out of the room. He was even more terrifying than she remembered. His navy suit was armor, his expression a mask of cold, imperious judgment. He found me, she thought, a fresh wave of nausea rolling over her. He tracked me down. It made sense. Of course he would come today. It was the perfect ending to the worst week of her life. First, she gets fired, humiliated in front of strangers, and now she gets served with a lawsuit that will bury her family in debt for generations. She wiped her tears with the back of her hand, trying to salvage a shred of dignity. She couldn't run. There was nowhere to go. Her voice was a broken whisper, barely audible in the dead silence. She looked up at him, her chin trembling. "I'm so sorry. I don't have the money yet. I need a little more time." She braced herself for the shouting. She waited for him to demand payment, to call her clumsy, to join Henderson in tearing her apart. But he didn't even look at her. Ryu Sunyi walked right past her. He moved with the fluid grace of a jungle cat, dismissing her apology as if it were dust on his lapel. He stepped into Henderson's personal space, looming over the manager until their noses were inches apart. Henderson, who had been shouting like a dictator moments ago, suddenly looked very small. He recognized the cut of the suit, the watch on the wrist, the aura of absolute power. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. "'Es, sir," Henderson stammered, a nervous smile twitching on his lips. He tried to regain his composure, gesturing vaguely at Sienna. I apologize for the scene. I was just handling a personnel issue. I was firing this incompetent girl for you. She's the one who ruined your suit the other day, isn't she? I'm making sure she never bothers a customer again." Sunyi stared at him. The silence stretched for 5 agonizing seconds. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, smooth, and utterly lethal. It was a voice that commanded boardrooms and ordered hits with the same tone. "You are mistaken," Sunyi said. He reached into his inner jacket pocket. Henderson flinched, as if expecting a weapon. Sunyi pulled out a folded document. He didn't hand it to Henderson. He tossed it onto the counter with a careless flick of his wrist. It slid across the surface, stopping right next to the spilled soy milk. "That is the deed to Global Roast Holdings," Sun-Yi said, his eyes never leaving Henderson's face. "As of 4:00 a.m. this morning, I acquired the controlling stake in this franchise." Henderson stared at the papers, his face draining of color. "What?" "I am the owner of this building. I am the owner of this coffee machine." Sun-Yi took a step closer, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "And I am the owner of her contract." He gestured to Sienna, without looking at her. "You don't fire my staff," Sun-Yi growled, the beast finally snarling behind the suit. "And you certainly do not speak to my future wife that way." The words hung in the air like smoke. Future wife. Sienna gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The customers gasped. Henderson looked like he had been slapped. "Wife," Henderson choked out, "but she's just a barista." "She is whatever I say she is," Sun-Yi said coldly. He straightened up, buttoning his jacket. "You, on the other hand, are trespassing. Get out of my shop before I have you removed." He didn't need to elaborate on how. The two massive bodyguards at the door took a step forward, cracking their knuckles. Henderson didn't argue. He didn't even pack his bag. He scrambled backward, nearly tripping over his own feet, and fled out the front door, the bell chiming a frantic farewell behind him. The brass bell above the door chimed one last time, swinging wildly as Henderson disappeared down the street. Then, the silence returned. It wasn't the terrified silence of before. It was the stunned, electric silence of a room full of people who had just witnessed a lightning strike. Sienna stood rooted to the spot, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The adrenaline was fatting, leaving her lightheaded and trembling. Her brain tried to replay the last 30 seconds, but it kept snagging on two words. Future wife. She stared at the back of the man in the navy suit. He was crazy. He had to be. He was the most powerful, terrifying man she had ever seen, and he had just told a room full of strangers that he was going to marry the girl who smelled like soy milk and despair. Slowly, Ryu Sun-Yi turned around. The terrifying mask of the ruthless CEO was gone. In its place was something far more dangerous. His eyes, previously cold obsidian, were now warm with a dark, simmering amusement. The corner of his mouth quirked up in a smirk that should have been illegal. He took a step toward her. Sienna wanted to step back, but her feet wouldn't move. She was trapped in his gravity. "You," she breathed, her voice barely a whisper. "You bought the company." "I made an investment," he corrected softly. He reached out. Sienna flinched instinctively, but he didn't pull away. He took her hand, the one that was still sticky with dried milk, and held it. His grip was firm, his skin impossibly hot against hers. He didn't care about the mess. He didn't care about the audience. With his other hand, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, copper object. Sienna blinked. It was a penny, a dull, scratched 2018 penny. She recognized it immediately. It was the same one she had pressed into his hand 3 days ago, begging him not to sue her. "You kept it," she whispered, looking from the coin to his face. "Why?" Sun-Yi placed the penny into the center of her palm, closing her fingers over it one by one. It felt heavy, like a promise. "I kept your deposit," he said, his voice smooth like velvet wrapped around steel. "It was a bold offer. I admire boldness." He leaned in closer, invading her personal space until all she could smell was expensive cologne and the faint, clean scent of rain. The rest of the coffee shop, the customers, the spilled milk, the ruined career faded into a blur. There was only him. "However," he continued, his thumb brushing over her knuckles, sending a jolt of electricity up her arm, "a single penny doesn't quite cover the damages to my suit, or my time." Sienna swallowed hard, her pulse fluttering in her throat. I can pay the rest, I just need." "I don't want your money, Sienna." He tugged gently on her hand, pulling her toward the door. It wasn't a question, it was a summons. "But I think we need to discuss the interest rates," he murmured, his dark eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her knees weak. "Over dinner. My car is outside." He didn't wait for an answer. He simply turned and led her out of the shop, past the stunned customers and the empty counter. As they stepped out into the cool Seoul afternoon, the black Maybach waited at the curb, the door already held open by a bowing driver. Sienna looked at the car, then back at the penny in her hand, and finally up at the man who had just rewritten her entire life. She took a breath, gripped his hand tighter, and stepped into the car. She stepped into the car. And just like that, she went from unemployed barista to the future wife of Seoul's most dangerous man. He didn't just save her job, he bought the whole building. Now I have to ask you, if a billionaire mafia boss bought your company just to save you from your manager, would you get in the car? Let me know in the comments below. Type yes if you'd take the ride or no if you'd run for the hills. If you enjoyed this story, make sure you subscribe and hit that bell icon so you never miss an episode of Urban K Story. We have a spicy part 2 coming soon where they discuss those interest rates over dinner, and you do not want to miss it. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next story.